Do you remember Tupac Shakur? On September 7, 1996, in Las Vegas, he was hit by 6 bullets in a drive-by shooting, slipped into a coma, and died 6 days later, at just 25 years old. To the world, he was the voice of a generation, a revolutionary rapper, a cultural icon who sold millions of records. But behind the fame was a man who repeatedly said, years before it happened, that he would not live past 25. Even more disturbing, he didn't whisper it. He said it openly on camera, in interviews, and inside his lyrics. How does a global superstar predict his own death with terrifying accuracy and still walk straight toward it? Rare photos and untold truths will be revealed in this video. Watch until the end to understand why Tupac Shakur remains a legend the world still cannot explain. Long before the night in Las Vegas, Tupac Shakur had already spoken his ending out loud, not as metaphor, not as bravado, but as certainty. In interviews throughout the early 1990s, he repeated the same sentence with unsettling calm, "I don't see myself living past 25. Then, in November 1994, the prediction almost came true early. Tupac was ambushed in a New York recording studio and shot 5 times. He survived, but something inside him didn't. After that night, the tone changed. His words slowed. His eyes hardened. He stopped talking about the future and started talking about time running out. Lyrics recorded in the months that followed sounded less like music and more like documentation. Funerals, coffins, betrayal, inevitability. This was not an artist fantasizing about danger. This was a man taking notes on his own disappearance. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Born in 1971, shot in 1994, sent to prison soon after, released in 1995, and then, in September 1996, at the exact age he had named again and again, Tupac was gunned down. 6 bullets, a crowded boulevard, cameras everywhere. No arrests, no convictions. How does someone announce his death years in advance and still not be saved by it? Even more disturbing were the images from his final weeks. Rare photographs show a man thinner, sharper, less celebratory. The smile was gone. In interviews, he swung between rage and clarity, between wanting peace and accepting violence as unavoidable. Friends noticed it. Journalists felt it. Tupac no longer spoke like someone trying to escape danger. He spoke like someone who had already accepted the cost. Was he warning the world? Or was he trying to convince himself that dying young would give meaning to a life that had never known safety? Was this fate closing in, or a prophecy fulfilled by pressure, paranoia, and fame that moved faster than protection ever could? And if he truly believed death was inevitable, did that belief change the choices he made, or did it remove the fear that might have saved him? Tupac Shakur was born on June 16, 1971, in East Harlem, New York, into a world already charged with fear, ideology, and surveillance. Even his name carried the weight of rebellion. Tupac Amaru was taken from an 18th century revolutionary executed after leading an uprising against colonial rule. This was not symbolism added later. It was destiny written at birth. His mother, Afeni Shakur, was a leading member of the Black Panther Party. While pregnant, she stood trial as part of the Panther 21, accused of conspiring to carry out coordinated bombings in New York. She was acquitted shortly before Tupac was born, but acquittal did not mean freedom. Surveillance lingered. Phones were watched. Addresses changed. Safety was temporary, if it existed at all. Money was scarce. Stability was non-existent. Evictions came without warning. Food was uncertain. Afeni, brilliant and fearless in political life, struggled with addiction as the years passed, a battle Tupac would later describe with equal parts love and anguish. Home was not a sanctuary. It was a place that could collapse overnight. From childhood, Tupac learned that systems did not protect people like his family. They pressured them until something broke. As the family moved, from New York to Baltimore and later to Marin City, California, 2 opposing forces shaped him at the same time. One was discipline, political theory, revolutionary language, the idea that words could challenge power. The other was reality, street violence, police harassment, and the quiet understanding that young men disappeared quickly in neighborhoods like his. He learned to read books and rooms with the same intensity. Poetry and survival became inseparable. At the Baltimore School for the Arts, teachers noticed something rare. Tupac was not merely talented. He was urgent. He studied acting, poetry, jazz, even ballet. Classmates remembered him as magnetic, emotionally overwhelming, someone who seemed to carry too much inside a young body. On stage, he did not perform characters. He released pressure. Every line felt personal because it was. Yet even in structured classrooms, there was restlessness. Tupac wrote obsessively, spoke rapidly, and lived as if time were already slipping away. Friends later said he behaved like someone who did not expect a long future, only a meaningful one. That urgency was not ambition alone. It was instinct. When the family relocated again to California, the contrast was brutal. Art gave way to corners. Mentorship gave way to survival. Mayor and city exposed Tupac to the full machinery of West Coast poverty. Guns that appeared too early, police encounters that escalated too quickly, friends who vanished into prison records or graves. He did not romanticize this world, but he understood it with painful clarity. This was where his worldview hardened. Tupac stopped believing in neutrality. He saw life as a constant confrontation between power and the powerless, visibility and erasure. Fame, if it ever arrived, would not shield him. It would expose him. Attention would amplify both protection and danger, and he sensed, long before success, that danger would always move faster. By the time Tupac stepped fully into music, his foundation was already set. He carried politics without slogans, anger without confusion, and empathy sharpened by loss. The childhood he survived did not simply influence his art, it programmed his expectations. Stability felt temporary, peace felt borrowed, and the idea of dying young no longer sounded impossible. It sounded consistent with everything he had seen. By the time Tupac Shakur entered the music industry, he was already fully formed, politically aware, emotionally volatile, and painfully articulate. His first real break came through Digital Underground, where he joined as a backup dancer and rapper. It was a small role, but it placed him close to microphones, studios, and the machinery of fame. When he stepped forward, he didn't sound like a newcomer. He sounded like someone who had been waiting. In 1991, his debut album Tupacalypse now arrived like a warning shot. The record wasn't polished. It wasn't designed for comfort. It was angry, confrontational, and unapologetically political. Songs spoke about police brutality, poverty, incarceration, and a generation taught to survive without mercy. For fans who recognized their own lives in his lyrics, Tupac became a voice. For critics and politicians, he became a threat. The album drew public condemnation, including from law enforcement groups, and suddenly Tupac wasn't just an artist. He was a symbol in a national argument. The speed of his ascent was dizzying. Within a few years, Tupac released multiple albums, each more successful and more intense than the last. Strictly for My N.I.G.A.Z. pushed him further into the spotlight. Me Against the World followed, recorded while he was under immense legal pressure, and debuted at #1 on the charts. The contradiction was striking. A young man facing prison was simultaneously becoming one of the most commercially successful artists in America. Hollywood noticed too. Tupac moved into acting with natural ease that surprised even seasoned directors. Roles in films like Juice and Poetic Justice revealed a different dimension. Charismatic, vulnerable, dangerous, tender. On screen, he radiated the same intensity he carried in real life. Audiences didn't see a rapper trying to act. They saw a presence that felt lived in, almost autobiographical. But fame didn't slow him down. It accelerated everything. The attention amplified his anger, his confidence, and his sense of being misunderstood. Interviews became confrontational. Performances felt combustible. Tupac spoke as if every appearance might be his last chance to be heard. He talked about loyalty, betrayal, and death with unsettling familiarity. Even as record sales soared and his name spread globally, behind the success, pressure mounted. Tupac was expected to represent a movement, a community, an entire generation. Every word was dissected, every action magnified. The industry rewarded his honesty, but offered little protection from the consequences. Fame did not bring stability, it brought exposure. The brighter the spotlight became, the more clearly his volatility showed. What made this phase so dangerous was not just how fast Tupac rose, but how little time he had to adjust. There was no gradual learning curve, no space to recalibrate. He went from survival to superstardom in a handful of years, carrying unresolved trauma into an environment that thrived on conflict. Success didn't heal him. It sharpened the edges. As Tupac stood at the peak of his early career, chart-topping albums, film roles, international recognition, something darker was already forming beneath the surface. The same intensity that made him magnetic was pulling him toward confrontation. Fame had given him a megaphone, but it had also stripped away the margins of error. And soon, those errors would no longer be theoretical. As fame tightened its grip, Tupac Shakur began to live inside a contradiction he could not escape. To millions, he was fearless, Defiant, articulate, untouchable. To the industry, he was marketable danger. But privately, the pressure to perform that image every day began to fracture him. Tupac wasn't allowed to be unsure. He wasn't allowed to soften. Any pause was read as weakness, and weakness, he believed, invited erasure. Public appearances became performances of armor. Interviews were sharp, confrontational, laced with suspicion. He spoke about loyalty as if it were oxygen, betrayal as if it were inevitable. The more the media framed him as volatile, the more he leaned into that framing. Partly to control it, partly because it matched the anger he already carried. Fame rewarded the extremes. Calm didn't trend. Conflict did. Behind the scenes, isolation grew. Success widened the distance between Tupac and the people he trusted. Money changed relationships. Attention distorted motives. Every conversation carried subtext. Who was real? Who was using him? Who would disappear when the spotlight moved on? He slept lightly. He moved constantly. He surrounded himself with people, yet rarely felt protected by them. The contradiction cut deeper when it came to empathy. Tupac was capable of immense tenderness toward women, children, the forgotten. Friends recalled moments of generosity that never made headlines. Quiet donations, long conversations, sudden acts of care. But those moments were incompatible with the persona the world expected. Rage sold records. Vulnerability complicated the narrative. His music mirrored the split. One track might sound like a battle cry, the next like a confession whispered too late. He wrote about paranoia, about being watched, about enemies hiding in plain sight. These weren't metaphors. They were daily sensations. Fame had not freed him from fear. It had multiplied it. Every success felt temporary. Every calm felt borrowed. The media simplified him into a symbol, because symbols are easier than people. Tupac was either a revolutionary hero or a dangerous menace, rarely both. That simplification followed him everywhere, flattening nuance and magnifying mistakes. When trouble came, there was little benefit of the doubt. The image had already been decided. What made this phase especially destructive was that Tupac understood the trap, but couldn't step out of it. He knew the persona was consuming him. He also knew abandoning it would leave him exposed. So he doubled down. Louder statements, sharper lyrics, harder edges, control through intensity. By the mid-1990s, the gap between the man and the myth had become a fault line. Publicly, Tupac looked invincible. Privately, he was exhausted, distrustful, and increasingly fatalistic. He spoke less about long-term plans and more about legacy, as if he were already arranging what would remain after he was gone. The image kept him famous. It also kept him cornered. And when pressure meets paranoia long enough, it doesn't dissipate. It detonates. The collapse did not arrive suddenly. It arrived piece by piece, disguised as controversy, lawsuits, and headlines that grew darker with each passing month. For Tupac Shakur, the line between scrutiny and persecution blurred until he could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. In 1993, legal trouble escalated when Tupac was accused of sexual assault. From the moment the story broke, the narrative hardened. To the media, he was no longer a complex artist under pressure. He was a symbol of excess and danger finally being exposed. Tupac denied the charges, insisting the encounter was consensual, but the case moved forward anyway. Courtrooms replaced studios. Lawyers replaced producers. Every appearance felt less like a defense and more like a public execution. While awaiting trial, Tupac was ambushed again, this time in November 1994, at Quad Recording Studios in New York. 5 bullets tore through his body. He survived, but the aftermath was worse than the wounds. Lying in a hospital bed, Tupac became convinced the attack was not random. He believed people inside the industry, people he had trusted, knew it was coming. Suspicion turned inward. Loyalty became a test no one could pass. Only weeks later, still recovering, Tupac was convicted in the sexual assault case and sentenced to prison. The timing felt cruelly precise. Shot, betrayed, then incarcerated. To him, it confirmed a single belief. When he was most vulnerable, no one stepped in. The industry that profited from his voice went silent when his freedom disappeared. Prison stripped away any remaining illusion. Confined, isolated, and furious, Tupac wrote relentlessly. Letters poured out, accusatory, reflective, unfiltered. He spoke about injustice not as theory, but as lived experience. Incarceration did not humble him. It radicalized him. He no longer believed redemption would come through patience or cooperation. Survival, he concluded, required leverage. That leverage arrived in the form of Suge Knight. In 1995, Knight posted Tupac's bail, securing his release in exchange for a recording agreement with Death Row Records. On paper, it was salvation. In reality, it was a transfer from one form of confinement to another. Freedom came with conditions. Loyalty came with expectations. Protection came with proximity to danger. The psychological shift was immediate. Tupac emerged from prison harder, angrier, and openly confrontational. The sense of betrayal calcified into doctrine. He spoke about enemies with names. He framed survival as dominance. The industry, the streets, the past, all merged into a single battlefield. The man who once balanced rage with empathy began to choose rage more often, because rage felt safer than hope. What makes this period so pivotal is not just the legal consequences, but the emotional conclusion Tupac reached. He believed the system had decided his role, spectacle, not citizen, scapegoat, not artist. If he was going to be punished regardless, he would control the terms. That belief shaped every decision that followed. By the time he walked out of prison, Tupac was no longer trying to outrun the narrative. He was preparing to dominate it. And in doing so, he stepped onto a path where escalation was not a risk. It was a strategy. Released from prison, Tupac did not return to the industry. He re-entered like a man who believed the rules no longer applied. The deal that freed him also bound him tighter than before. Death Row Records promised protection, resources, and an outlet for his fury. What it required in return was allegiance. In that exchange, Tupac found momentum, but he also inherited enemies he did not choose. The music that followed came fast and ferocious. Studios became war rooms. Sessions ran through the night. Tupac recorded with the urgency of someone racing a clock only he could hear. The tone shifted decisively. Less reflection, more confrontation. Betrayal was no longer a theme. It was an accusation. He named rivals, drew lines, and dared responses. Each track felt like both a release and a provocation. What hardened him most was a conviction that the industry had turned its back when he needed it. Old alliances dissolved. Silence from former peers felt louder than criticism. In interviews, he spoke about loyalty as if it were extinct, about trust as a liability. The paranoia critics dismissed as theatrics had roots in lived experience. 2 shootings, a conviction, and the realization that success did not buy protection, only exposure. Yet even in this escalation, contradictions persisted. Tupac could be warm one moment and volatile the next. He showed generosity to those he deemed loyal, ruthlessness to anyone he suspected otherwise. That volatility kept people close. And at a distance, circles tightened, advice narrowed, dissent disappeared. The echo chamber grew louder. Publicly, the narrative was irresistible. A brilliant artist reborn after prison, louder and more dangerous than ever. Privately, the pressure compounded. Security increased. Movement became calculated. Sleep shortened. Trust thinned. The same intensity that fueled his. Creativity fed the conflicts surrounding him. Each appearance felt like a test of dominance rather than performance. The most damaging shift, however, was philosophical. Tupac stopped imagining escape routes. He spoke openly about consequences as if they were foregone. When friends urged caution, he heard control. When critics warned of danger, he heard inevitability. The belief that his fate was sealed didn't calm him. It removed hesitation. If the ending was fixed, then acceleration felt rational. By late 1995 and into 1996, the lines between music, image, and real-world conflict blurred beyond separation. Songs spilled into interviews. Interviews spilled into confrontations. Confrontations invited retaliation. Each step reinforced the next. This was no longer a spiral driven by ignorance. It was momentum sustained by conviction. The betrayal Tupac felt, by institutions, by peers, by systems, became the lens through which he interpreted every event. That lens sharpened his voice and narrowed his options. He was louder than ever, more visible than ever, and paradoxically more alone. The stage was set not by a single decision, but by a sequence of choices made under pressure, fear, and a belief that retreat equaled erasure. What followed was not an accident. It was a collision point of anger, allegiance, and a culture that profited from conflict while offering no exit. And the final escalation was already in motion. At Death Row Records, Tupac Shakur found what looked like armor. Suge Knight offered muscle, money, and momentum. The label moved fast, loud, and unapologetic. Exactly the tempo Tupac had adopted after prison. Studios became fortresses. Security became routine. And loyalty, once a principle, became a currency measured in proximity and obedience. The music exploded. In 1996, All Eyes on Me arrived as a declaration of dominance, vast, relentless, and commercially overwhelming. It wasn't just an album, it was a statement of survival. Tupac sounded invincible, omnipresent, everywhere at once. But the triumph carried a cost. Every track sharpened divisions. Every line felt like a challenge issued to anyone listening too closely. The East Coast-West Coast rivalry, once a loose regional competition, hardened into a narrative the media could monetize. Headlines simplified complexity into sides. Cameras followed confrontations. Radio debates amplified insults. Tupac, already convinced betrayal was endemic, stepped fully into the role of standard bearer. The conflict gave shape to his anger, and the anger gave the conflict momentum. What began as lyrical sparring escalated into personal grievance. Names were spoken, motives questioned. The past, especially the 1994 shooting in New York, was reinterpreted through suspicion. Trust evaporated. Any silence was read as complicity, any disagreement as hostility. The rivalry stopped being metaphorical. It became logistical. Inside death row, the atmosphere intensified. Parties felt like rallies. Appearances felt like tests. Tupac moved an entourage that grew tighter and louder, a wall of sound and presence designed to deter threats. Yet the very visibility meant to protect him also made him predictable. Routes repeated. Patterns formed. Attention accumulated. Interviews from this period reveal a man oscillating between clarity and confrontation. He spoke about peace in the abstract, but war in the specific. He insisted he wanted unity, after enemies were neutralized. The contradiction wasn't hypocrisy. It was exhaustion colliding with belief. Tupac no longer trusted de-escalation. He trusted dominance. The industry, meanwhile, applauded. Sales surged. Coverage multiplied. The spectacle paid dividends. Conflict kept cameras rolling and records moving. Few incentives existed to slow the machine. Warnings, when they came, were framed as noise. Caution sounded like censorship. And Tupac had already decided he would not be managed into silence again. As 1996 progressed, the pace became unsustainable. Shows stacked back-to-back. Travel tightened. Sleep shortened. The margin for error vanished. The same intensity that powered creativity now powered confrontation. The rivalry was no longer something he participated in. It was something he inhabited. What made this phase lethal was not bravado alone, but certainty. Tupac behaved like someone who believed the outcome was fixed. That belief stripped away hesitation and replaced it with acceleration. If the world wanted a war, he would not blink. If the spotlight demanded spectacle, he would deliver. The cost, he seemed to accept, was secondary. By late summer, the tension had condensed into moments. Glances held too long, words repeated too often, movements tracked too closely. Las Vegas loomed on the calendar not as a destination, but as an intersection, and the forces converging there had been gathering for years. As the rivalry intensified, Tupac Shakur began to live as if every public moment carried consequence. Security tightened, but so did routines. Appearances were announced in advance. Movements followed familiar paths. The very visibility meant to signal strength also narrowed unpredictability. Protection became presence, not prevention. Tupac's rhetoric sharpened further. Interviews blurred into indictments. Lyrics became receipts. He spoke with the certainty of someone convinced that retreat would only invite erasure. Friends urged restraint. He heard control. Advisors suggested distance. He read betrayal. The conflict had moved beyond music into identity. To step back would be to concede the story, and Tupac refused to be edited again. Media pressure compounded everything. Cameras chased confrontations, froze moments, replayed gestures. Each frame fed a narrative of escalation that rewarded extremes and punished nuance. The industry thrived on the heat. Records sold. Headlines multiplied. The incentive structure was clear. Conflict paid. De-escalation did not. And in that environment, the loudest voice set the tempo. Inside death row, loyalty was tested daily. Entourages grew louder, tighter, more performative. Nights blurred into parties that doubled as strategy sessions. Alcohol flowed. Adrenaline replaced sleep. The margin for miscalculation shrank. In such spaces, perception mattered more than truth. Respect became currency. Slights demanded response. Silence was interpreted as weakness. By late summer 1996, warning signs were everywhere. Tensions flared at events. Words were exchanged in public. Grievances traveled faster than facts, yet the machine kept moving. Schedules were locked. Appearances were commitments. Pulling out felt like surrender, and Tupac had already decided that surrender was not an option. Las Vegas was supposed to be a celebration. Fight night, cameras, crowds. A city built on spectacle. But spectacle cuts both ways. The night compressed months of pressure into hours. Eyes followed. Movements were noted. The sense of inevitability, spoken about for years, hung heavy in the air. What makes this moment tragic is not that danger existed, but that it had become normalized. Risk felt familiar. Tension felt routine. The extraordinary had turned ordinary. When everything is charged, nothing feels urgent until it's too late. As the night unfolded, choices were made quickly, almost automatically, inside a framework that had been constructed over years. Loyalty demanded presence. Presence demanded visibility. Visibility demanded confrontation. The chain had no weak links left to break. The rivalry did not pull the trigger by itself, but it created the conditions where escalation felt unavoidable, caution felt like betrayal, and survival felt secondary control. By the time the streets emptied and the noise receded, the momentum had already carried the story to its final threshold. What followed would not just end a life. It would freeze a generation in a question that still has no answer. The night of September 7, 1996 was supposed to be routine. Bright lights, celebrity rows, cameras everywhere. Fight night in Las Vegas promised spectacle, and Tupac arrived exactly as the city expected. Visible, surrounded, unmistakable. The atmosphere buzzed with adrenaline and noise, the kind that makes danger feel distant because it feels familiar. Inside the MGM Grand, tension flared. A brief confrontation, quick, public, combustible, ended as suddenly as it began. In another context, it might have dissolved into rumor. Here it became fuel. The night moved on. Plans stayed intact. Momentum did not slow. Later, just after 11 p.m., Tupac rode in the passenger seat of a black BMW along the strip. Traffic crawled. Neon reflected off glass and chrome. Music played. Windows were down. The car stopped at a red light near Flamingo Road. In a city designed for visibility, everything was visible. Then a white Cadillac pulled alongside. Witnesses reported the flash first, muzzle flare slicing through the night, followed by the sound. Multiple shots ripped through the BMW. Chaos erupted in seconds. The car lurched forward. Screams cut through music and traffic. In the aftermath, Tupac had been struck by multiple bullets, including a critical wound to the chest. Blood pooled. Sirens closed in. The Strip, loud moments earlier, fell into stunned fragmentation. At the hospital, doctors fought to stabilize him. A chest tube was inserted. A lung collapsed. Internal bleeding spread. Tupac drifted in and out of consciousness before being placed into a medically induced coma. Over the next 6 days, updates came in fragments. Hope rising, then slipping. Fans gathered. Media camped. The world waited. On September 13, 1996, Tupac Shakur was pronounced dead. He was 25 years old. What followed should have been clarity. Instead, it was absence. Despite the location, the witnesses, the cameras, the attention, no arrests, no convictions. Leads evaporated. Accounts conflicted. Rumors multiplied faster than facts. The investigation stalled, restarted, stalled again. Silence became the loudest outcome. Questions hardened into permanence. How does a shooting in one of the most surveilled corridors in America leave no definitive answers? Why did witnesses recant? Why did momentum disappear? The case seemed to dissolve into the same haze that followed Tupac for years. Visibility without protection, noise without resolution. In the days after his death, images circulated. Hospital corridors, candlelit vigils, stunned faces. The city moved on. The questions did not. Tupac's body was cremated quickly. No public burial. No final confrontation with closure. The ending arrived without an ending. And in that vacuum, theories took root. Not because mystery was seductive, but because certainty was withheld. Each gap invited speculation. Each delay deepened doubt. The case did not close. It simply stopped moving. Las Vegas had delivered the final chapter exactly as the pattern predicted. Public, abrupt, unresolved. A life lived under a spotlight ended beneath one. And still, the truth refused to stand still. In the hours after Tupac Shakur was rushed to the hospital, the city did what it always does. It kept moving. Traffic returned. Neon kept blinking. By morning, the Strip looked untouched. The investigation, however, never recovered its footing. Despite the location, one of the most crowded, most photographed corridors in America, evidence fractured quickly. Witness statements conflicted. Some recanted, others went silent. Surveillance that should have clarified movements produced gaps instead of answers. Timelines blurred. Leads appeared, then evaporated. The case advanced in headlines, not in courtrooms. What made the silence heavier was its consistency. People who had spoken freely in interviews suddenly stopped talking. Stories changed. Cooperation thinned. Fear did not need to be announced. It was inferred by absence. In an ecosystem shaped by loyalty and retaliation, truth became negotiable and discretion became survival. Officially, the investigation continued. Practically, it stalled. Years passed without charges. Names circulated in whispers. Motives were debated endlessly. Retaliation, rivalry, coincidence. But evidence never assembled into a conclusion sturdy enough to stand. Each theory solved one problem and created another. The more attention the case received, the less it moved. The speed of the aftermath deepened unease. Tupac's body was cremated quickly. There was no public burial to anchor grief, no courtroom sequence to anchor accountability. Closure was deferred, then displaced. Fans mourned without answers. The industry memorialized without resolution. The absence of finality became part of the legacy. Over time, the lack of answers reshaped memory itself. The death stopped being an event and became a question, one that refused age out. Every anniversary reopened it. Every new rumor widened it. The case did not fade. It calcified. What remains unsettling is not only that the truth is disputed, but that the conditions which obscure it were visible long before the night in Las Vegas. The same forces that amplified conflict and rewarded spectacle also discouraged de-escalation and transparency. In that environment, a clean ending was never likely. Tupac's death crystallized the contradiction that defined his life. Maximum visibility with minimum protection. A world that watched him constantly fail to keep him safe, then failed to explain what happened when he was gone. The investigation's inertia mirrored the industry's earlier silence, attention without responsibility. And so the case remains open in spirit, if not in motion. Not because mystery is fashionable, but because resolution never arrived. The questions linger not as conspiracy, but as consequence. When systems move faster than care, outcomes arrive before understanding can catch up. What Las Vegas left behind was not just an unsolved crime. It was a permanent pause, an ending without punctuation, a final scene that refuses to cut to black. After his death, Tupac Shakur did not recede. He multiplied. Albums recorded in fragments and late-night sessions were released one after another, filling the silence he left behind with words he never got to explain. The music sounded unfinished by design, urgent, raw, prophetic. It carried the same tension that defined his life. Tenderness colliding with fury, hope pressed against inevitability. His influence spread beyond charts. Tupac became a reference point for artists who wanted honesty without permission, politics without polish, vulnerability without apology. He was quoted in classrooms and courtrooms, debated in essays and documentaries, invoked whenever art and activism crossed paths. For many, he remained frozen at 25, forever intense, forever unfinished, while the world around him aged.